week's Urbe ad Astra bonus episode 3, part 2, continued straight on from the previous episode. Because some people don't pay any attention to the rotation and things like that, I had been expecting that readers would be thinking, oh, how are we going to have the point of view of the character who is dead? But only some readers would be thinking that, and the ones who weren't paying attention wouldn't be thinking it.
Yeah, makes sense. And that's you're always writing for a spectrum of readers, and you have to.
Yes.
You're writing for the readers who already read this book and are rereading it. You're writing for the readers who know the historical subject matter you're drawing on intimately, the people to whom this is totally new, the people who vividly remember all the chapter titles, the people who are good with names, the people who are bad with names.
Yep. You've got a whole lot of people there.
Yep. And you often have how can I remind people who this character is for the people who won't remember this name without annoying the people who do remember this name?
I sometimes think, people can just turn back and find if they can't remember it. But I think I'm sometimes wrong to do that, and I should give people more help remembering when there's a lot of names.
Yeah. It's tricky. It's extra tricky when your narrator has no reason to give us the reminder.
Yes.
And that can make it very tricky. How do we naturally slide in the reminder in this moment when it's hard to justify the character doing so?
It's one of those things where first person is so much easier, because when you're writing in first person, you can have the character give the reminder in character, and you can be establishing things. Not always, but often.
Sometimes first person makes it harder if the narrator has no reason to give you the reminder at that point. It depends on your first person. Because if it's a first person they're writing a history, or they're explaining this to some third party, or they're writing it down as a memoir or it's a letter, then they might have a good reason to remind the addressee or the imagined reader what this is. I often can use that with Mycroft. But when it's, first person, we're watching through the person's eyes and as if a camera is rolling, it can be harder to be, the person is just thinking, oh, hi, it's Geff John. And doesn't have any reason to say, oh, yes, it is Geff John, my friend who I met at the thing and, did the other thing.
Yes, first-person brain dump isn't any easier than it is in third. First-person reflective is easier. First-person reflective is a form that I like, where the text is being written by somebody at a time for a reason.
Yeah, and it gives you so many tools. Although, and this is something that relates to chapters, it also means that every time you're crafting a chapter, you're thinking about how this character feels about writing this stuff down. And what this character knows about what's going to happen already. And whether anything has changed between this and the last one. So in the first 2 books of Terra Ignota, Mycroft is writing a history of events that are over at the point that Mycroft sits down to write it. So the whole thing has an emotional consistency. Whereas in the second 2 books, it's a chronicle and things are happening unexpectedly to Mycroft in between the writing of chapters. And so Mycroft might write a chapter and then sit down to write the next chapter in a state of sudden jubilation or sudden grief. I have to think through carefully the mood with which Mycroft approaches each chapter. And that can make the craftsmanship of the beginnings of chapters especially both extra difficult and extra rich. Because if this chapter is going to contain an incredibly important world-changing thing, or an incredibly tragic thing that the narrator is just broken by. The narrator knows that, and it's just happened at the moment that the narrator sits down to write it. And so you have to make the opening of the chapter be authentic to the grief or dread or jubilation or exhaustion, the fresh emotion that the character feels,
mm-hmm.
without giving away more of what you want to have happen in the chapter be given away than you would wish. Because they can start the chapter with, so-and-so is dead, and then you're in the Patroclus sequence of, but how did so-and-so die? Or they can start with, I'm overwhelmed, and you don't know about what. And then you're in suspense as to, okay, what has my narrator so overwhelmed that their chapter began with an incomprehensible tangent? Or you're almost reading the opening paragraph, hunting for clues as to what it is that has put the character in this very extreme mood, which is quite different from when they're writing it all at once and reach the chapter in which, a tragedy is about to happen. And the narrator knows this, but it isn't fresher for them writing that chapter than writing the chapter before. It's distressing having to think about it and having to, this is the chapter where I have to face up to describing the tragedy at last. But there isn't shock. Whereas when it's live events or diary or letters, there can be shock as well. And that is both a craftsmanship asset and a craftsmanship challenge.
I found it difficult in among others where it was diary. I had to make it plausible that she would write out the events in order when something shocking had happened and you weren't going to find out until the end.
Right.
And that was definitely a craftsmanship challenge.
Because when you sit down to write a diary or a letter, you usually start with, oh my God, so-and-so gave me $1 million or whatever it was that the big thing is. And then you explain how it went. But you don't always want that to be the structure of your chapter.
Right. And I sometimes did that. But other times I had to work on it to make it plausible that she would sit down and write something that would take literally hours of writing before getting to the revelatory thing. And sometimes I'd lead with it, and sometimes I wouldn't. And it was a difficult thing. And also, I would then the next date would often be like 5 days afterwards,
because the person had to spend several days probably writing down the intervening thing too. That's true also in especially the first 2 books of Terra Ignota, that the how far apart the chapters are written. You can see this more in book 3 actually, where the dates are clearer. That the how far apart, I calculated carefully how long it would probably take the character to write the book. And then felt really resentful when I was like, this person wrote this chapter in 2 weeks. I wrote it over 7 months because but a person for whom these events were easy and who doesn't also have to write letters of recommendation would write this chapter in the course of 2 weeks. So that's a plausible amount of time.
I did a thing in The King's Name where I've got a frame on those books where the narrator is saying that she is 93 and she's writing the story of her long life, and she goes back to when she's 17 and it moves forward through time. And towards the end of the second book, we are getting to the point where a beloved character is going to die, beloved by her, and I hope by the reader as well, but beloved by her. And so there is a chapter end at the end of a battle, and he's been wounded. And then the next chapter starts off with, I never actually told you about this training thing we did 20 years before this. I think I'm going to write about that for a while.
Yes, having the character be evasive about the next thing that has to happen. Yeah. It was just very powerful when the reader realizes, wait a minute, you're putting off telling me what just happened. Why are you putting off telling me what just happened? Like, Gene Wolfe does this in Book of the New Sun a couple of times, where Severian will be like, I'm fleeing the city now. Let me describe at great length the layout of the streets and the architecture and what the sky looks like. And you're like, Severian, why are you fleeing the city? You're fleeing the city for a reason. There are people chasing you. Why are you? You're ashamed of the reason you're fleeing this city. I see. And then you gradually feel like you're coaxing out of him the actual shameful reason that he's fleeing the city. And it's a very effective method. But you have to note that your readers will realize at varying points that you're doing it, right? And some readers may never become conscious of the fact that the narrator is evading telling you the thing. And other people will notice it very early and have a meta intrigue of, oh, interesting, we've jumped around. Why did we jump around? Why are we suddenly in a flashback?
Yes.
Or a flash forward. Yeah. Very fun.
There's a painting in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, which is by Barents Fabricius, who was a pupil of Rembrandt's. And it is St. Matthew writing the Gospel. And he's an old man, and an angel is whispering in his ear, and he is holding a pen in a very badly done hand, and he is writing. And he's got this expression in his face, and you can just tell that he's got to the sad part that he doesn't want to write.
Aww.
And that he would want to say to the angel, do I have to write Gethsemane? Couldn't we go back and write some more miracles, Do I have to write the part where Jesus dies? And, you look at that, or I look at that as a writer, and I recognise that's me when I get to the sad part of the book that I've got to write. And I don't even have the angel. I've still got to do it.
Well, but also we recognize that as something that our first-person narrators who are writing this as a document
very much
are experiencing. And you sit down and say, okay, I have to write this person describing this grief-filled incident. I want to communicate the character's grief. I can communicate the character's grief through making the narration suddenly a bit less competent and a bit more disjointed, and, choosing less prudently how long to describe a thing, or, lingering extra on how the air tastes, and describing stuff in that extra vivid way we do on a day when we've had shock and we have vivid visual recollection of the room we were in where the terrible thing happened, which is too vivid in our memory, and therefore can be described a little too vividly by the narrator in a way that very effectively communicates shock and sets up for the reader to be prepared for the thing that's about to happen to be something that has shocked and grieved the narrator.
And again, this is a writing skills challenge to make that work. Mm-hmm. And it's often also, because it is often a chapter beginning thing in this situation, then it is a challenge that you're bringing the reader at that moment.
Well, and that can be thrown off very easily because you're writing it intentionally not your full craftsmanship, or you're applying your craftsmanship to making this thing seem a little clumsy in how it's crafted. And it's a very small push from it seeming clumsy in a way that's deeply moving and elegant and intentional, and seeming clumsy as if the writing is bad. And I remember, Joe, when you first read a chapter in which I do this, and came to me and said, like, for the first time in any of my work that you'd ever read, that like that chapter just really didn't work and needed to be heavily redone. And I removed one paragraph, and you reread it and said it was perfect.
Yeah.
And it was this very, very tiny tipping of and it was one of those flashback where they're evading getting to the topic by describing this other thing, but it was just a single paragraph too long of the thing, and it had to go.
And it was a new narrator as well, which did make a difference.
Mm-hmm. But it was a neat example of how that is a tricky technique that is immensely powerful when successful, but you really do this is what good beta readers are for, need to get the pacing and degree of the slight shock, slight out of order, slight disproportion of description just right.
Yes.
No.
Yes, and it's a hard thing to do. It is really
very hard,
very difficult, and very worth it when you can make it pay off. And another similar related thing that is often a chapter beginning thing in first person like that is suppressed excitement. Because you know that it's going to be there. You know, you the narrator know that it's going to be there and that you're bursting to tell it. And that's another thing that is that is like
and that's
that.
exactly this. You can in the first sentence say, we landed on the moon, everyone! Exclamation point. And then which is the same as the so and so is dead. Opening sentence, or the Watson, it is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write the last words I shall ever write of my friend Sherlock Holmes, which tells you in the first sentence of the story what's going to happen. You can do that and it can be powerful, or you can say, no, I want the fact that they've landed on the moon, or the fact that Holmes is dead, to be saved for partway into the story and have suspense about it, but you think about the craftsmanship.
Yeah.
So a completely different facet of chapter planning that I wanted to make sure we talk about before we stop. When I'm starting a chapter, I find I tend to think of it as it'll either start with a line of dialogue, or it'll start with narrator voice. And that those, in my brain, are the sort of two macro categories of chapter starts. That it'll start with a character saying something, and then we jump into what the setting is after we've heard the person say a thing. Or it'll be starting with the narrator making a comment. And sometimes the narrator comment will be quite short, or it'll start with a single sentence and then do other things. But to me, those are the two ways I tend to, I'll sit down and think about a chapter. How do I want to open this? I want to open this with narrative reflection, as opposed to, I want to open this with dialogue. Which has a very different energy, especially, I think, for us, Joe, for whom our narrative prose tends to be very metric.
Yes.
And my dialogue, at least, tends to be very natural and non-metric. And I think the same is true for you sometimes.
It varies. Again, this is a thing that varies with me from book to book, and I've written several things where the style is pastiche. So in the Small Change books, the third-person chapters of the Small Change books, the detectives chapters, are very much a pastiche of Josephine Tey and Agatha Christie, and that kind of very particular kind of 1930s cozy mystery thing. And with the beginnings of those chapters, I was always thinking, do I want it to be hard or soft? Do I want to start with something that is going to be a jolt, or do I want to start with something that will be comforting? And so I was very much thinking about that, because the style of all of them was the same. But I was very much thinking about that when shaping those, because those are the two ways that you start chapters in those kinds of books.
Interesting.
But then with other books, I think about that kind of opening. Sometimes I will have the first sentence of a chapter and be excited about it and how I'm going from that. And sometimes I won't at all, and I'll noodle around and I'll know the sort of emotional feel that I want, but I won't know actually where to start it, and then I will see it and it'll pull me through. Often because I'm trying to start either too early or too late.
Interesting. I would say I sometimes at the outlining stage, if the chapter is going to begin with a major, again, this is Terra Ignota specific and not quite true of others.
Right.
In Terra Ignota, when a chapter was going to start with a major Mycroft philosophical aside about something, that would sometimes be part of the outline. And this is the chapter that will start with the reflection on Terra the Moon Baby, and then these things will happen in it. That would sometimes be part of the outline, but other chapters wouldn't have any particular specific what's the beginning in the outline, and I would do it based on how the voice and mood ended up of the previous chapter, so that in my head it's dialogue versus narration as the beginning of a chapter. Though within narration, at least within Terra Ignota, there was a big difference between narration, which is Mycroft deciding that it's the correct time to lecture us about Diderot for a page, and narration where it's, describing the car landed in a place and there was a mob and there was this and there was that. And these things happen, which are setting the scene, not giving a philosophical aside. But in some sense, when you turn the page and you see that the chapter begins with a block paragraph, there's a moment during which it doesn't yet matter whether the block paragraph is going to be the car landed and there was this and that, or whether it's going to be, by the way, Diderot. Because it's both telling you that your first experience is going to be with the narrator, not with other characters doing things. And there's, I think, a different energy to plunging straight into dialogue, which is often being in the hands, so to speak, of a different character or having a different character's voice going on, rather than the narrators, which is why, even though in some sense beginning with the car landed and we went here is more similar to beginning with, hey, look, they've landed, than it is with Diderot as a dude who did blah, blah, which isn't setting the scene, and the other two set the scene. But on the other hand, which voice we're in, what mood we're in, how much of a change in mood it is different. And if the previous chapter ended with the narrator having a deep philosophical reflection, I'm going to be very conscious of, and if I start with the same narrator, it doesn't feel like there's been as deep a breath taken. It doesn't feel as if there's been as much of a change of mood. It feels as if there's more continuity. If I begin with somebody calling out, hey, look, it's Felix Faust, then we have a more complete change of mood. And that breath that's taken is deeper. Some readers will even, as they're deciding, should I pause now or should I not, will, in their peripheral vision, see in the next chapter begins with another heavy, long paragraph versus, the next chapter begins with a snappy-looking short line, which will affect the decision of, is this a moment where I feel like you need a break, or is this a moment where I feel like, some freshness and pep, which is what I want, appears to be available either in the form of going to the fridge and getting an apple, or in the form of reading this lovely piece of dialogue with an exclamation point on the end, which is peppy in the way that getting an apple from the fridge is peppy, in a way different from, reader, let me tell you about Terra the Moon Baby and reflections upon the nature of distance, for which you might want to go get an apple first. And so I think about what's actually the reason that the car landed and we went here is more similar in my mind to the Diderot intro than to the line of dialogue intro, is the effect that seeing that in the edge of your eye has on the reader's calculation as to whether to keep reading or pause.
So I think that I don't know whether to call this sort of plot or theme, but I have a thing that is going to happen in the chapter that I know is that the chapter is about.
Yeah.
And it might be plot, or it might be theme, or it might be something else. But
indeed, because sometimes the core function of this chapter is so-and-so has to meet so-and-so and fall in love at first sight. And sometimes the function of the chapter is we need to be introduced to the theme of space exploration being a focus in this book.
Right.
And they are co-equally the function of the chapter, even though the latter isn't a plot point. It is a thematic point.
And sometimes the function of the chapter is it's a Here's to Valhalla chapter, and that this chapter is there solely to give people an emotional break between two emotional highs. So we will have a chapter and it'll be doing a bunch of other stuff, but the real function of that chapter is to have a pause so that you can start going up again on a higher level of emotion. But I just realised, and this is true, the chapter that I'm writing at the moment is 2,800 words now, and it needs about another 500 words, and I know where it's going. Yeah. And the chapter starts, the line snaked through the spaceport terminal. And this chapter is going to end when the character comes out of that line. When he is at the conclusion of that line, and a plot thing will have happened, and he will have met two of the major characters and thought about a third major character who's been trailed through this chapter, but who we're not going to meet until the next chapter. But this is the chapter in which the line snakes through the spaceport terminal, and he snakes through the line until he comes out of that snake at the end of that thing. And that's the way that the chapter feels to me. And if I were writing a proper plot, this would be the snaking line chapter.
Right, in your
Even though that's probably not how other people will think of it when they read it, if I ever finish this thing and anybody ever reads it. But that's how it is in my mind.
And you do feel those moments of, the reader needs a moment of lightness here. How do I do it? And it can be a whole chapter that's lighter. It can be a chapter that has a lighter moment or a lighter piece in it, or that, begins light but gets heavy again. But you can also find, even if it's, I need a whole lighter chapter here, who are two characters who are fun. Oh, neat. I can have these two characters who are fun having a conversation, which connects up and gives us some important information about the consequences of what's happened before, so that the character, what do we really need at this point? We really need to happen to hear what the political fallout is of the thing that just occurred. But we also need a moment of lightness. So I'll have the two characters who have a really good sense of humor be having the conversation about it. And also, these are both characters I want to give more development to. This works really well. As a break. So it's not a vacuous chapter. It's a chapter that accomplishes a lot. But it's a chapter where you sat down from the beginning to say, all right, I need to accomplish the things that need to be accomplished in this chapter, in a way that also feels like, you're doing interval training on your athletic equipment machine, and this is one of the ones where it gets lighter for a few minutes, and you get to breathe a little more slowly and catch up on your oxygen before it kicks in the high intensity version again.
Yes, and your peppy apple as well. It's the same.
Yes. Yeah.
You wanted to talk about non-fiction chapters?
Sure, let's do that a little bit before wrapping up. So in non-fiction, I have 2 non-fiction books under my belt, and you have a couple which have a very different structure because yours are collected from blog posts. And I have one which is an academic book based on a dissertation, which in turn takes the structure of each chapter is a distinct body of research that could be its own article, which works as a structure, but is not a very thought together as a structure-y structure. Yeah, but the one I'm working on now, which has distinct chapters, I have felt myself using, dividing it into big sections. So there are 4 big sections, and then each section having a bunch of subsections. And that has flowed very naturally as I was working from the nonfiction book in a way that no fiction quite did.
My essay collections are collections, and each piece was written as a shape, but I don't really think of them as chapters.
Yeah, very much collections. So I think that, in the nonfiction history that I'm writing, a lot of the structure of history is, here is my argument, now I'm going to prove it. And what the reader is in suspense about, in as much as there's suspense, is what evidence is this person going to muster to argue this, right? This person is arguing that the Renaissance was not a great time to live, that it was a rough time to live. Interesting. What is the evidence that they're going to use for this claim? And are they going to address the claims that are the reason that I always had the impression the Renaissance was a golden age? And, in what order and with what argumentation are they going to make this? But, one of the best ways to structure history is you make your claim up front, and then people are excited to see you back it up. Or sometimes antagonistically confident you'll fail to back it up. But that sure still is something that's going to give them momentum moving forward to read. But it means that you can very easily have chapters and subchapters where the subchapter is the historic claim you're going to make here. Or the new piece of evidence you're going to introduce. So you can have the desperate Renaissance as a section, and then you have a section about Rome, the eternal problem city. And that's going to be how Rome contributes to the Renaissance being desperate. And then you can have, a Petrarch subsection, and then people know that that's how Petrarch is going to contribute to it. So they all become like the outline of a lecture or the outline of a debate, where you're saying, here is my argument and here are my 5 pieces of evidence. And that lends itself quite naturally to the chapter, subchapter section, because it's all about being upfront about what you're going to argue and then arguing it. And I know that I had to sort of learn how to do that, because my impulse was to save the revelation until the end and make my argument when I was ready. But it's easier to understand and remember the information if you know where it's going, if you have the argument on which to hang your information, and you know what all of these threads are coming together toward. These are all evidence that the Renaissance was a hard time to live. I know I'm reading along looking for things that are evidence that the Renaissance was a hard time to live, as opposed to, okay, we've had a lot of discussions of wars and of plagues and of life expectancy and of people not getting along with other people and of Isabella d'Este not paying her dues. I'm not quite sure where this is leading. It's leading to this, but by this time I've forgotten what some of the evidence was. That you benefit from the fact that people remember things better when they relate to something concrete or are serving something specific. And so by having the argument up front, the Renaissance, don't live there, time travelers, right? And then your evidence as to why, they have something to hook that to. And then people genuinely remember more of the material, even if it's the same material in a different order.
So the other non-fiction thing that I've written is my memoir, my travel memoir about a trip that I took in 2019, where the chapters are the days, and they're not organized by chapter except by day. But each day I was doing different things. So the day that I went to Voltaire's house at Cirey, and the day that I went to Diderot's house are the perfect times to talk about Voltaire and Diderot within the book. And then, Petrarch and the same thing. But there is also this arc of travel and where I was and what I was doing. So even though it's non-fictional and kind of true, I was still totally shaping the material that went into it. And I was definitely thinking hard about where I started the chapter, where I started the day, whether I started with getting up and setting off, or whether I started partway through with reaching somewhere, or again, whether I started with a philosophical discussion, or whether I started with breakfast. Mm-hmm. In terms of what I was doing with all of that kind of stuff. But it definitely wasn't the kind of non-fiction where I'm making an argument, or mostly it isn't.
Right.
It's just a record of stuff.
Yeah. Because nonfiction has a huge amount of breadth to it.
Yes. But it's called Visiting Friends, and the friends that I'm visiting in it are Voltaire, Diderot, Petrarch, and Pico della Mirandola. This is available as an ebook if you want to read it.
It's really, really fun. But it's also, I mean, it's an essay in the Montaigne sense of an essay, of a meander through ideas and delight.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And it's also like other people's travel memoirs, that people write travel books that are just like that.
Right. Well, and some fiction which will divide by day.
Yes.
But sometimes it doesn't work. So the way, the first 2 Terra Ignota books are 5 days. And so it'll sometimes say, and this was
7 days, isn't it?
7 days. It's 7 days. It'll say, this is the end of the first day. This is the end of the second day.
And then it says, increasingly long days.
Yes.
With the whole planet.
And then, and at this point, without actually sleeping, the day is rolling on to the dawn of the next day, even though we just kept up all night doing things, as the intensity ramps up. But that has to be not even section breaks. It's not section breaks. It's just comments as it goes, because the subdivisions there need to be by theme and place and occasionally narrator and time, and not by day. But day works well for other structures. Chapters are such great tools. They can accomplish so many things. That breathtaking and reset.
I recently I've been reading a KJ Parker book. I've been reading a couple of KJ Parker books that are in a series. And the first one has very, very short chapters. The chapters are 1 minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And I'll read tons of them. And then the other book, the sequel, has chapters that are like 25 minutes. And even though I am absolutely positive that when I was reading book 1, I was reading it for 25 minutes at a time or more, it felt faster to read because I was coming to these little short chapters. And there were more breaks. And I could think, do I want to carry on reading? Or shall I go to the bathroom and then carry on reading? Shall I stop reading and read something else? And it's just an interesting, different thing when it's the same author and the same series to have that difference just because of the chapter length.
Well, I'm, amid the trickle of lovely people on Twitter saying that they've finished Perhaps the Stars and that it's great, I get occasional tweets from people on Twitter saying, I'm reading Perhaps the Stars and this chapter is really long and I have a job and kids to take to work in the morning. Why didn't you warn me this chapter was so long? It's 3 a.m. now. Yes. And I'm like, oh, I know which chapter you're in. I'm sorry. You can't stop now.
Yes. Well, your bladder will make you stop at a certain point,
But sometimes just the momentum needs that kind of length as well.
And it is unfashionable to have chapter titles. But I did it with Tooth and Claw, and I did it again with Or What You Will, and you've done it with Terra Ignota.
I wasn't aware that it is unfashionable. How could you possibly sacrifice such a powerful resource?
Well, I'm hoping that people will start using them more again because they'll see how excellently you used them in Terra Ignota, because that was part of what I was thinking with Or What You Will, because I just loved what you did with the chapter titles, and I thought I could do such fun things with chapter titles and quoting things in Or What You Will. Yeah. Every chapter title is quoting something, but sometimes you never know what. It would be hard to be sure what. Because one is quoting a play that I saw in Montreal in 2007 that probably nobody else has seen who would be reading the book or recognise, but I don't care. It's a good thing to quote in that context. And it's not meaningless if you don't know what it's quoting. It's
That's one of the keys. You got to make sure that thing will still work, even if people don't recognize that it's an intertextual reference to some other work. Yeah.
Yes, people shouldn't feel like they're missing something if they don't get it. And then you're giving a delightful little bounce to people who do get it, and it doesn't matter at all to anybody else. That's very much what I feel about that kind of thing generally. But anyway, it was delightful doing chapter titles, and I will do chapter titles in other things. I'm sure I will, because it's fun, and I'm wondering if this may start a trend of doing chapter titles because they're great.
I think they are. And I know with Terra Ignota, I made a special note to Tor when they were doing the layout asking, can you do that thing where the chapter title appears in the header on every page throughout the chapter? Because you're not consciously reading it on every single page, but you occasionally glance at it and you're reminded of it. And it makes it more likely that the reader will remember the chapter title when they get to the moment in the chapter that connects to that title, if there is a particular moment, or just that they'll be reminded of it as a thematic element as they move forward. And Tor's wonderful, delightful layout people who have always not only done everything I asked for, but even made it more beautiful than I ever imagined, were happy to do that. And I think that it makes a big difference having it just present so that you see it as you flip through and advance through the chapters. And I've been happy to see some of the translated editions maintaining that, because the chapter titles really are, the book works without, but that perhaps the stars hits double strength when you remember it from before. And a lot of things hit extra strong when you remember it from before. And some of the chapter titles, like Rose Tinted Daydream, that call back to other moments in the text, are very enhancing of the power of the thing. Not essential, right? It's the sauce on the pasta. The pasta is delicious even with just olive oil and pepper, because pasta is a wonderful thing. But the truffle addition to the pasta and the olive oil makes it even more potent. So this has been a great conversation. In my tradition, first we will gush about a book we've been excited by lately, and then finally the administrative mandatory podcast stuff. Joe, what's a book you've been gushing about lately, or would like to gush about?
I've just finished Dickon Bew's Slow Train to Switzerland. One tour, two trips, 150 years and a world of change apart, which is about a English guy who lives in Switzerland recreating the tour that was the first tourist tour that Thomas Cook did to Switzerland in 1863. And he has the diary and letters of the people who took that original tour. And he takes his mother with him, and they try to do the same things that they did every day, but now as much as they can, and if their hotels still existed, they stayed in them. And what it actually is a history of affordable tourism in Europe. Neatly intertwined with the history of Switzerland through the second half of the 19th and the 20th century and up to today, and how tourism has interacted with the Swiss economy and the Swiss culture and all of this. And it's really very, very interesting about all of those different things, as well as being a delightful travel story of people going to various places in Switzerland and having fun, which is just a nice escapist thing to be reading. But it's also got all of this other fun, interesting stuff going on. It's quite a short read, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Excellent.
So, how about you?
Well, I've been excited about a book that I know, Joe, you started reading also, which is Last First Idol, which is a recently translated Japanese novel, which was the first ever debut novel to win a very prestigious, Hugo-like award in Japan, making it the Seiun Award, making it a sort of neat, what is happening with an uncommon instance where a debut work has won this. And it's a really odd work that's drawing heavily on tropes in the Japanese science fiction that we associate with anime, but also on idol culture, Japanese celebrity, the being an idol, which is a youth celebrity thing that's not quite the same as anything we have in US or UK celebrity culture, but comparable. And so it has aliens, and it has artificial life forms, and it has extremely violent, over-the-top combat structured within this competitive celebrity idol thing. It's a very manic kind of pace. It's a very striking and strange book. Just interesting to glimpse an example of something where it's riffing on tropes you need to be familiar with for it to make sense. It's not the kind of science fiction that's approachable from just a regular launching off from science fiction stance. I guess I might compare it to Scalzi's Red Shirts as a Hugo winner, in that it's a Hugo winner with a lot of intertextual required past knowledge to understand what it's doing. So it's been neat having access to that. We often don't get translations of the Seiun Award winners out of Japan, and we often, in fact, don't usually get translations of most other countries' award-winning science fiction. I don't know, as someone who also read Joe, whether you want to add anything to it.
I didn't read it. I read the first third of it, and it was much too bloody and horror-like for me. Mm-hmm. After the world had been destroyed, and it was just so unpleasant, and I didn't like the characters.
Yeah, it's very clearly being influenced by a recent trend in deconstructionist examination of both idol and magical girl culture, which was launched by the success of a series called Puella Magica Madoka. The word magi should be in there too. Puella Magi Magica Madoka is the series, which did a magical girl deconstructionist thing where it being violent was one of the things that was shocking and interesting, because in that style of narrative, usually there's extreme combat at which the world is theoretically at stake, but nobody ever dies. And so seeing a variant on that where the stakes were grim succeeded in being very surprising through pacing, and very successfully deconstruction, and triggered dozens of variant deconstructions of this fascinating genre, which always has female protagonists and is about sort of empowerment and combat, but can also be very male-gazy and disempowering depending on who is writing it and how it's being structured, or what exactly is going on. And there's been a burst of that in many different media. So some of it comic books, some of it prose. In which I think the violence is there as one of the ways of signaling this is going to be a deconstructionist examination of this genre instead of a straightforward one. But you're right that it makes it horror-like and off-putting in a way that
and there
complex.
Was a giant plague that killed most people, and everybody left has cancer. And I just found that a bit grim.
Yes.
And I just wasn't enjoying it, and maybe because it is so much in dialogue with things that I'm unaware of from other directions.
I think that's part of that's what gives you the interestingness to move forward through it. But I also think that it is grim, and that it's being grim partly because it's going to do stuff with the grim, but partly because being grim is a signature of this style or this way of deconstruction.
But that's not something that I enjoy, and there were bits of it that were sort of positively stomach-churning.
Well, and it makes me think about how rare but also delightful some of the works that are deconstructionist but not violent, like Sugar Sugar Rune or indeed Astra City are, when they are being mature and intelligent and questioning the tropes of a medium at a more adult level than normal. Pluto would be an example of this as well. But not doing so by suddenly being grim.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a wuss. I do not like reading horror. I do not like reading things that are distressing.
Yeah.
And it was distressing. And I asked you if it was about to get good and about to change, and you said no, it was going to carry on being like that. And I stopped reading it because I just wasn't having any fun, and I read for pleasure. And there was not pleasure happening. But I totally agree with you. I want to see more things in translation, even if they're things I don't like. And I'm not at all sorry that I paid for this book, and will encourage them to publish more
stuff in translation. Yes.
And I'd like to see more things in translation from other places as well. From other languages.
We've been getting a lot of Japanese stuff in translation because of anime manga fandom. We're now suddenly starting to get Chinese stuff more.
Yes.
Which is really good, and a little bit of Finnish stuff and French stuff. But let's have more translation. We should be like France that gets translations of everything.
Right.
Anyway, and
it would be great. I would really like that. And I am more inclined to read something if it is in translation, and I might be getting that, whatever it is. So even though I didn't like this particular book,
still exciting that it's out. Last First Idol.
Okay, let's do the boring bit.
Yes.
This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives International 4.0 license.
You can support us and get episodes in advance at patreon.com/Ada Palmer, and you can support Joe and get her wonderful poetry, as well as this morning's translations of 2 sonnets about the French invasion of Italy in 1494 at patreon.com/Plujo.
And you can find us on Twitter and our books and things at joewaltonbooks.com and adapalmer.com. So until next time, ex Urbe, ad Astra.
Ad Astra.